you ready? Let's go.
When you're feeling bothered and your spirits low, your friends have turned their back and there's nowhere to go. Don't shed a tear, 'cause God will give you hope. If you're curious, then turn on. The Late Show with your number one man. Hope you let your heart. The Late Show, watch it 'cause you can. This is the Late Show starring Matt
All the way from the land down under, from the heart of Melbourne, the most livable city in the world, the land of the kangaroos and koalas. Ladies and gentlemen, would you please welcome the one and only Matt the Man.
Good evening and welcome to yet another great episode of Melbourne's very own Late Show. I'm your host, Matt Yunan. It's great to have your company as always. There's a lot of things in life that I don't understand. One of those things that I just can't understand, no matter how hard I try, is women. I guess that's why I'm single, hey? No, but you know what they say, women. You can't live with them and you can't live without them. Wow, some of you are thinking, can't believe he just said that on an international TV show. Well, guess what? I just did. Have you ever been in a situation where you couldn't find the right words to address a certain topic without offending anyone? Have you ever been offended when people say or use common terms that can be harsh? Have you ever felt pressured to be polite about something that you don't necessarily agree with? If you answered no, well, then we don't have an episode for you tonight. Thanks anyway, and see you next week. Just kidding. You can't get rid of me that easily. Well, actually, you came to the right place, because tonight we'll discuss why things that were fine to say 20 or 30 years ago have suddenly become taboo and considered politically incorrect, and how to be politically correct, and whether society is actually becoming too soft. Are we becoming too sensitive? In the society that we live in today, some of us might find it difficult to talk about certain topics or issues, such as homosexuality or different religions, because you want to avoid awkwardness and you don't want to offend or hurt anyone. Even though we have freedom of speech and you should be able to express your opinion openly and freely, you have to be careful not to abuse this freedom. You can always get your point across, you just need to say it in the right way. You know, sometimes we're at work and a conversation will come up about religion or something and you're afraid to say something or express your values and beliefs because you're afraid of what people will think of you. You're afraid that they might think differently of you. Remember King Solomon, the wise. He told us in his book of wisdom, chapter 7, verse 15, May God grant that I speak with judgment and have thought worthy of what I have received. For he is the guide even of wisdom and the corrector of the wise. So how can you be politically correct and yet have a strong opinion at the same time? It sounds contradictory, right? Because you have to please people and also stand up for what you believe in at the same time. Well, you have to choose your battles carefully. And remember what all our parents told us, to think before we speak, eh? Think before you speak. Well, that's easier said than done. So, to tackle this week's complicated topic, we're very lucky enough to have a gentleman who knows all about being politically correct and being politically sensitive. He's worked in politics in both the Australian and the US governments. He was a foreign policy and national security advisor and senior international advisor to the federal government, including the Australian Prime Minister Kevin Rudd and the Minister for Defence. He's worked in New York providing political risk consultancy to the US government and Wall Street institutions, and was awarded the Australian Overseas Humanitarian Services Medal. He's currently the Director of Corporate Affairs, Strategy and Communications at SBS. The list is endless when we begin to think of this gentleman's achievements. Ladies and gentlemen, would you please welcome the one and only Peter Khalil. Hi Peter. Peter, thank you so much for taking the time to join us tonight.
Thanks for having me, Matthew.
Thanks. So I want to start off by asking you, is it true that when you were working in the US, that you actually met President Obama and told him where to go? Oh, sorry, that's probably politically incorrect. I mean, I think you met him and testified or something in front of him?
It's only a half-truth, actually. Firstly, he wasn't president at the time. He was a senator, a junior senator. And I was working in the US, and I had the opportunity to testify before the US Senate Foreign Relations Committee. And Senator Obama, then Senator Obama, was on that committee, as was currently Vice President Biden. He was a senior senator at the time. And it's the type of experience, almost as nervous as I am on being on this interview with you. You had all these senior US senators in that horseshoe, in front of you, and you're a witness, and you're sitting at the table, the cameras are flashing and the lights are in your eyes. And what they do is they give you an opportunity to talk about a particular issue, and I briefed the Senate Foreign Relations Committee on US foreign policy in the Middle East and security policy in the Middle East. And then they ask you lots of questions. They effectively interrogate you to an extent. But I certainly didn't tell Obama where to go. In fact, I found it was interesting because Biden, who was the deputy chair of the committee at the time, he asked a lot of questions, as did all the other senators. And Obama, because he was the junior senator, had to wait right till the end of the hearing to get his opportunity to ask me questions. And when he did ask me questions, I found it really, really interesting that they were quite intelligent questions, which was a bit surprising. It seemed like he was wanting to learn about the issues. He didn't know that much about them, but obviously as a junior senator he was willing to learn, and he asked me a lot of questions. And I remember thinking, this guy's pretty intelligent. This was in early 2005, and I remember going back to the office that day, and everyone's like, "Oh, we saw you on TV, you did a great job," and so on. And I said, "No, don't worry about that. I think I met the future president of the United States."
Wow, you could pick it from there.
Well, I did pick it. I should have, I'm not a betting man, but if I did, he was probably about 500 to 1, so I would have made a lot of money if I did bet on him.
So that's amazing. I mean, is there anything that you haven't achieved? Like you've even worked.
No, there's a lot. There's a lot of things that, there's a lot of things that I've done probably because it looks interesting because I only do them for a year or two and then I move on to something else. So that's why it looks like there's a lot of stuff done.
Just seems like you've achieved everything. So good on you.
That's not true.
Is society becoming too soft? You think about things that we used to talk about 20 or 30 years ago and it was normal in society, it was a norm. Now it's obviously taboo and you can't talk about it. People are very politically sensitive, what's politically correct and whatnot. Why do you think that's the case?
There's two parts to your question. I actually think that the first part, which is talking about society being soft, is a little bit different than talking about what people can and can't talk about today. There's certainly been changes in that, for good and largely for good, and some bad to an extent. On the soft part, I mean, one thing I've thought of, which is pretty obvious. I remember when I was a kid, we used to go out after school and play footy or cricket in the street. We'd go down to the creek or whatever it was, to the park, on our bikes, on our BMXs or whatever it might be. Parents didn't. They just let you go off and do what you did. Come back for dinner and go out. It was a different world. Now I notice with my younger cousins and young kids today, they're inside the house the whole time. They're on computers and iPads and all the different gadgets that we have. They're not out there playing. They're not out there. There's a real lack of physical activity actually, and you see some of the problems there with regard to obesity with young people, young children, as well as health issues. So I think that's, in that sense, in that regard, yes, I would agree with the statement that society's become softer for those reasons, and I think that's a problem. These are real issues with higher percentages of obese young children. So I'm all for more physical activity, sport, getting out there and engaging. So on the other part of your question, as far as things that are taboo to talk about and what are not taboo, what's not taboo, Australia 30 years ago was a very different country.
Absolutely.
And certainly there was a lot of types of prejudice, overt racism. People would just say things that were very hurtful to others based on either their race or their ethnicity or their religion. So the good part of that is that we have evolved as a country where that's not acceptable anymore, and that kind of overt racism. I remember experiencing it when I was a lot younger, in the schoolyard or in the football field or wherever it was. It was very overt. It was in your face. It was hurtful, and it was wrong. That's changed. That's changed a lot. I guess what you're sort of asking is whether we've gone too far and people are too scared to say their point of view. I think the good thing there is that this country, Australia, still has freedom of expression. You're allowed to express yourself freely.
But within limits.
Within limits, and I think that, but free speech has always had limits. There's a famous legal case about the guy in the cinema who cries fire. It's like the boy that cried wolf. You can't just call out fire and have everyone panic and run out when there's not a fire. You're under some limitation. So free speech has some limitations to it. As far as whether we've gone too far, I think it's a common sense thing. I think if most people know in the public that if someone says something, it's the context of what they meant. If they didn't really mean to be offensive or racist, but they happen to do it, by mistake, people understand that. I think people can clearly see when it's really offensive and it's meant to be offensive. Like those louts that were on the bus in Melbourne that attacked those French students, and were very racist towards them and abusive towards them. People know when it's really offensive and when it's not, and I trust the common sense of the public on that.
It's interesting that you said that obviously how Australia's changed over the last 30 years, I suppose, and that was clearly illustrated through an example earlier this year with Sydney's captain Adam Goodes in the AFL, where he was called a monkey, and he's an Indigenous Australian, and yet the uproar over that was incredible.
Yeah.
Because obviously he was racially vilified, and but yet 30 years ago that would have been absolutely acceptable.
No, absolutely, you're absolutely right. I mean, 20 years ago, that kind of language would have been, the norm towards whether it be Indigenous people or people of colour or different ethnicity. People used to call people wogs all the time, in the schoolyard and stuff. I think what happened with Goodes is a really good example of it, because the power relationships were very different today. Goodes is the superstar AFL footballer, and this was a 13-year-old girl, and I think what he did right was to say, I don't want people to punish the girl. It's not her fault. It's about education and it's about understanding. Whether she understood the context of using the word monkey towards an Indigenous person, because it had been used so historically as a term of offensive abuse towards Indigenous people or black people generally, whether she understood that is about the lack of education or otherwise that she had. So I think Goodes handled himself admirably and honourably.
Absolutely.
And you didn't really want to see, and what I was concerned about was to see the young girl be, hit from pillar to post in the media and in the public, and I'm glad that didn't happen.
Yes.
But there are instances, I think, when you're referring to where sometimes the public and the media jump on something when maybe the perpetrator, didn't really quite understand or didn't mean it and was taken out of context. So those things do happen sometimes.
Absolutely. How can we learn to think before we speak, and I suppose to be more politically sensitive to those around us?
I'm glad you used politically sensitive. I really don't like the term politically correct. I think it's become a bit of a flashpoint term for people who react towards it and identify it with a position that some in society take that try and enforce these boundaries, and people feel a bit, constrained, and they feel like their freedom is being constrained and what they can and can't say. Look, this has gone on for time immemorial, from the beginning of time. People need to think about what they say before they say it. I mean, if I've got a flash of anger and something comes out and I hurt, with what I say, I hurt my friend or my partner or my parents or whatever it might be, everyone does that to a certain extent. So it's not a new thing to try and control your anger and your temperament. This is well before there was such a thing as being politically correct and politically sensitive. I think the difference now is that there is a bit more of an understanding that certain terms which were used openly, like the monkey thing that we talked about, are not appropriate, and they are hurtful. And I think it's important that we all, as individuals, we take the time to make sure that when we're thinking about, are we hurting this other person? I mean, that's a very Christian thing as well. You want to have empathy with other people around you, and you certainly don't want to deliberately hurt that person. The grey area is when you don't know that you're hurting them.
Yeah, absolutely.
In saying what you're saying, and that's where there can be some difficulties.
Yeah. If we disagree with something, or someone says something and it doesn't sit well with us, how can we take a stand and yet still, I suppose, get our point across? still be politically sensitive towards them, and conduct ourselves in an appropriate way whilst taking that stand.
That's a big challenge for everyone. I'm not sure I'm an expert on this. You learn as a diplomat when you're working in the foreign service and so on, certain diplomatic skills. They call it diplomatic language and diplomatic skills. Very careful in the way that you use words and the way that you have meanings in certain words and so on, and there's sort of second and third meanings and so on. I think it's not just politically sensitive. I mean, there's being culturally sensitive, sensitive to other people's faith, things like that. Look, again, I'm not an expert on this, but I would say maybe I'm an expert in the breach of it rather than in the practice of it. So maybe that gives me an opportunity to say, I know because I've made the mistakes. I think it's important to...
But we all make mistakes, I suppose.
Yeah, no, but it's always... You want to be respectful of other people's viewpoints. And be able to allow them to express themselves, to express their views, and do so without the language. Sometimes, when you're in an argument with someone, you tend, and if you're angry and you're emotive and so on, you can cut them off. And I know I've done that in the past. You can talk over them, and I've done that in the past. You can not listen. You can hear, but you're not really listening to what they're saying, because you're in a one-track thing that you want to get out what you want to say. So I think the main thing there is to really take a deep breath and really listen to what that person's saying. If you can say, look, I really acknowledge, it's the way you use language as well. If I'm having an argument with you, Matthew, and you say something that I really disagree with, I can say, look, I acknowledge that's your opinion, Matthew, but I disagree with it, and these are the reasons why. I'm not going to say, oh, Matthew, that's rubbish. Yeah. You're talking rubbish, because that immediately inflames it to a next level of an argument, and you get because I'm denigrating what you've said. But if I say something like, Matthew, I understand, I respect that you see it that way, but maybe you should have a look at it this way. And maybe it's the way that it's the way that you use language in those conversations that can add respect to the conversation if you really are willing to listen to that person.
Yeah, using a bit of empathy, I suppose.
Yeah, and empathy, you all know, empathy means being able to put yourself in the other person's shoes.
Absolutely.
And feel what they feel, understand what they understand. And if you can do that, even if you don't agree with what they're saying, you can at least bring the conversation to a point where you might get some sort of resolution around things. You may not agree at the end of it, but at least you haven't alienated each other to that extent. You've at least tried to feel what the other person's feeling.
Yeah. Absolutely. And finally, Peter, what advice have you got for people watching us tonight to help them be more politically sensitive, as you say, instead of politically correct?
My advice to people, well, again, I feel reluctant to give advice because I'm no great politically sensitive person on this kind of stuff, but
no need to be modest.
If anything, I think the importance is always think about what the other person's viewpoint is. Try to listen to them rather than just hearing, or hear them really, rather than just listen to them, because you can I can listen to you, Matthew, and not really hear what you're saying. And
effective listening.
Yeah, effective listening, and when you do respond, try not to use inflammatory language, because when you do that, that immediately pushes people into a defensive position or a defensive posture, and you can escalate an argument in that way. And sometimes, the other thing I'd say is sometimes you'd be surprised, you could actually learn a lot from other people. Even if you disagree with them, the way that they approach a subject from a particular angle or a perspective could actually inform your thinking a little differently, and you learn from that and you become a better person from that. I don't recall any argument I've ever had throughout my life where it's been a bad argument, for example, or an insensitive argument, that I've come away with it thinking I'm satisfied, or this was, I didn't regret it the next day or the next week or the next month. But I can say honestly that every time there's been even if I've disagreed with someone, there's been a constructive discussion about it, where they've acknowledged what I'm saying and I've acknowledged what they're saying, but we still disagree, but we at least learnt a bit more about each other and about the subject. I take that every time over the former. So,
and I suppose, like you said, not to use inflammatory language. Sometimes when we're angry, we might say things that we regret. So that's why sometimes I always say, just walk away and then come back to it later.
Yeah, if you're that angry, I suppose you should probably walk away and talk about it later.
Yeah. Thank you very much for your time tonight, Pete. We really appreciate it.
Thanks, Matthew. Thanks for having me on the program.
Thanks a lot.
Cheers.
Okay, Mariam. So some people don't like addressing people by, you know, their skin color.
Because they're black.
No, not just. There's a lot of derogatory terms for white people too. And
White people, they're so offended by everything.
Mariam, I want you to understand that people can and do take offense to it, so we need to be sensitive of that. So, I'm just not understanding how you're not getting this. Have you never ever been offended by something someone said?
No.
No. So, I'm sure so if I said that because you're a woman, you're emotionally unstable and can't think with your brain, you would take no offense to that.
Yeah, I probably missed my pills that day.
How can I make you understand that certain you can't say stuff like that to people, and that you think that using the word fat is okay?
It is. It's much better than using the words like of a large body composition or of greater skin pigmentation instead of saying black, because let's be honest, that's what the color is. Like if I get out my crayons, there's going to be a white one, there's going to be a black one, but then when we talk about people, all of a sudden that becomes offensive.
Yeah, because you can't label people like that, because there's more to them than just their color.
And I'm aware of
And
that. I'm
why
not
should they
limiting them to a single color.
But you're
That's just
differentiating.
part of it.
But why do you need to differentiate between people based on color? Like, why is that significant? Why can't you say, oh, he's got 25 million hairs on his head, not 26? Like, why isn't that an issue for you?
Because you were talking about skin color. I'm not labeling a person solely based on that.
All right. So what about people like certain races with special body, features, or that stand out, or I'm sure obviously different races have different genetics, and so they look a little differently, and certain people address.
Yeah, like Asian eyes.
Yes, like Asian eyes. Some people may find that offensive.
Why? Because they don't have a full view.
But
It's just a tad
no.
slanted, just a ching.
But you're Egyptian. I mean, you have huge eyes. I mean, as if you don't. How would you like
All
someone
the
to say that
better
to
to
you?
see you with,
or
my dear.
Or a long chin.
Yeah. Goes all the way back to the pharaohs.
Okay. I don't know how to convince you. I'm losing you. I do apologize for the segment, and we did not know where this was going to go.
You didn't even mention anything about Indians.
Oh my God. Thanks for watching.
So to sum up today's topic, first of all, I'd like to tell you all about the fish, which has evolved as a symbol of our faith. I want to tell you the story of how this fish came about. So a fish cannot ever swim with the current unless it wants to end up dead on the shore. So the fish must always swim against the current to avoid death. It is exactly what we as Christians do. We swim against the current. We will surely not agree with a lot of things that happen around us or certain behaviours exhibited by people, but as Christians we are encouraged to speak up against such things in a Christ-like manner. We are encouraged to have an opinion, but we must be wise in how we express it. When putting forth your opinion, ensure that you consider who you are talking to. So put aside your pride and be careful with your choice of words. Avoid using language that will make a person feel excluded or devalued. It has become very common to generalize situations when we speak. Often we find ourselves experiencing something and automatically applying it to everything and everyone around us. For example, if you've ever had a bad experience with Chinese food, say, the first time you eat it, you'll most likely say that all Chinese food is terrible. We must challenge ourselves to look past generalization. If you do so, then accurate descriptions are the essence of being politically correct. Be aware that the words you choose can mean different things to different people. A lot of common expressions have further implications other than their obvious meanings, and so when we say certain things, we should carefully consider whether it is appropriate and also whether it will make anyone feel excluded, as I said before. Finally, we can take an example from our Lord Jesus Christ himself. Jesus Christ was not always politically correct. In a way, being politically correct is put in place to please man instead of God. We, as Christians, must develop a balance between maintaining our morals and values while still being politically correct, for the mere purpose of not being judgmental or offending the people around us. From the teachings of the Bible, we were called to spread the word of God, but we must do so in a knowledgeable, sensible, and correct manner. We must also be able to determine when it is right for us to speak and what is right for us to preach about. So that's all from me today.
As Christians, we need to have a strong opinion on things. We can't just go with the flow. Remember, as we heard from Marina tonight, a fish that swims with the current is a dead fish. In life, we'll be faced with struggles and questions that we need to know how to address carefully. And we only have the best church fathers to learn from. As His Holiness, the late Pope Shenouda III said, the world sees in our conduct, in our behaviour, the proof that we are the real children of God. Abraham Lincoln said, it's better to remain silent and be thought a fool than to speak and remove all doubt. When you have something to say or you feel something is against your values and you need to speak up, there's nothing wrong with that. But just ask yourself, do I really need to speak? Winston Churchill said, courage is what it takes to stand up and speak. Courage is also what it takes to sit down and listen. There's nothing wrong with speaking up, but sometimes silence is what's actually required. St. Arsenius, who was the personal tutor for the princes, had a famous saying. He said, many times I've spoken and regretted it, but of being silent, I have never regretted it. Having said that, there's a time and a place for everything. And if something is against your beliefs and against the teachings of the Bible, then there's absolutely nothing wrong with taking a stand and expressing your views on the issue. But just like Peter taught us tonight, that we need to do it with a bit of empathy. Put yourself in their position. When you're speaking to people, put yourself in their position and then express your concerns. And finally, remember that we have 2 ears and 1 mouth, so that we can listen twice as much as we speak. It's okay to speak your mind. We're not saying you shouldn't, and we're not saying you shouldn't be mindful of how others might feel. But at the end of the day, we have freedom of speech, right? And we're not saying you should abuse that freedom, but just because the media says you should not say something doesn't necessarily mean a thing. So think of why you need to be politically incorrect or politically insensitive, and if you have a legitimate reason, then make your point, but be kind about it. Politically incorrect or politically insensitive does not mean being unkind or rude. So, that's all we have for you tonight. So thank you for joining us. We hope you enjoyed tonight's show. And please feel free to give us some feedback. We love feedback. On behalf of our whole team, thanks for watching, take care, God bless, and have a great night.
Are you ready? Let's go.
I'm just going to have a little chat with one of the youth about political correctness. Marina, you want to introduce yourself? Is it Mariam? I'm so sorry. By the way, quick disclaimer. This episode, I bear no responsibility for what comes out of this.
What do you mean? I'm always natural.
No.
I need my lines because I forget my script, but that's different. That's my memory is hopeless. I do know. You reckon my
Because
Am I a potato? Like saying.
What did you just say?